I apologize in advance. I don't speak Italian. I understand a little bit, but I'm going to just speak in English. If anybody isn't understanding something, please feel free to ask questions. Mirta asked me to come and talk about small farms and small farms in the U.S. and North America and kind of what that looks like. And so I'm going to go through and show some pictures of different farms that I visited there and my own farm and other farm projects that I've worked on. I'm incredibly honored to be able to come here and talk to all of you. This is the furthest I've ever traveled to give a talk. So I have done international talks before, but in Canada, so I don't know if that counts across the board. So the first thing I wanted to start with is to show you all where I'm from relative to Italy. And you probably all are familiar with the map of the United States, maybe a little bit. What I've done is I've just slid Italy over so that it's at this more or less the same latitude. So where I'm from is about right here in Oregon, about right there. So pretty far north, what would be pretty far north in Italy. And this is the state that I live in, Oregon, right there. And there's a group of us that have come from mostly Oregon and Washington. So I'm going to just zoom in on that section. Oops, I need to go this way. So it moved a little bit, but Portland is right here. And I think this is actually more accurate because this here is the 45th parallel. So that's about right for Italy, I think. And that's important when we're coming to look at vegetables here and to look at what you're doing. We have very similar day lengths. And the ocean is right here, so we get a little bit of a warming effect from that ocean. It's a little bit warmer here. Most of our weather comes this direction. Sometimes it comes from this direction, in which case we get very, very cold weather. But most of the time it's coming from this direction. The other people, if you met any of the other farmers from our delegation, the other farmers were from the Portland area, from the Seattle area, and also from Walla Walla, which is here in Washington. And then there was one person from New York City, total opposite side of the country. So I want to start with Four Seasons Farm. So in the U.S., most of the farms, just by number and size, are very, very large farms. But there has been a small farm movement that goes back a long ways and really got started with organics in the 1970s. And this guy, Elliot Coleman, started a farm, Four Seasons Farm, and wrote a book called The New Organic Grower. And that has been a very, very influential farm. And he is actually in Maine. I'm just going to, I'll flip back here. So he's here on the coast of Maine. The weather on this side of the country comes from here. And so it's actually much, much colder on this side of the country than we are. So Four Seasons Farm is about, I think it's about 1 hectare. I can't remember off the top of my head. But for anybody that doesn't know, I also wrote a book. And what I do in the book is I go through and I talk about 15 small farms that are under 5 acres, which is about between 2 and 2.5 hectares, and that are successful. In the U.S., there's one in Canada, and Elliot Coleman's is one of those farms in that book. And he has also written a number of his own books, which are all excellent. So I had the opportunity to visit him a number of years ago, and this is an example of his small farm. I have a few pictures from his farm. What you're looking at right there is, this is in December, so it's pretty cold. It snows a lot where he is, but he still harvests for 12 months out of the year by using these tunnels, and he developed these tunnels that he moves. So this tunnel here has moved all along here in stages, and it's filled with chickens. And so the chickens are fertilizing for the next season. And then this tunnel here has moved from there over to here, and that has crops in it that he'll be harvesting through the snow. Another picture of that. More crops in the field in December. This is inside the tunnels, carrots that he grows. I wanted to include this slide because this kind of goes back the step before. So this is the house just down the road from where he is of some of his mentors and the people that sold him the land, Helen and Scott Nearing. And I don't know if anybody's heard those names, but they were very early in the Back to the Land movement in the U.S., I think in the 1950s, and wrote a lot about it. They wrote a book called The Good Life and Living the Good Life. And they were up in Maine, and they sold Elliot his land. I think they sold it. I know that Scott Nearing sold the land to Elliot that Elliot is on now. So actually, I'm going to go back for just a second. This was all forest when Elliot bought it, and he cleared it by hand and created this farm. So it was all like this before. Scott Nearing, who owned this place, also cleared this all by hand, and he sold Elliot the land in 1969, I think, for the same price he had bought it in the 1950s, $35 an acre. So very, very cheap. His land is just down maybe 300 meters the other direction. So they're right on the water on the Atlantic Ocean. And they use the kelp from the ocean to fertilize the fields. This is another mentor of mine, Michael Abelman, who's also written a number of books. And he's most well known for a farm that he had in Goleta. So I'm going to keep going back and forth here. So the farm that he's well known for, it was about here on the coast of California, near Santa Barbara. I don't know if people have heard of Santa Barbara. He now farms, and the pictures I'm going to show you are just across the border on a little island right about here in British Columbia, Canada. So Michael farms, his entire farm is about 50 hectares, but most of it is forest. And he has one big field where he grows some grains and some dry beans, but the most of the farm is small berries and fruit and vegetables, and that's only about 1 hectare, maybe even a little bit less. Cover crops are very important on the farm. There's a picture of cover crops. Just some pictures out in the field of carrot harvest. These are pictures that were taken, I think, in September, but it was pretty cold in September. They're harvesting strawberries there, and the strawberries are covered with plastic, these little low hoops. And then to harvest it, they uncover the plastic, but they need more warmth. More pictures of harvest in the field. He does some interesting things with berries. So these are raspberries. They're on a trellis system, so they climb up the trellis, but the trellis tilts over, and so you can see it leaning over. And it tilts both ways. So what they do is they tilt it one way when it's flowering, and the flowers all reach for the sun, and so they're all on one side of the trellis. And then after they've all flowered and set fruit, they tilt it the other way, and then the fruit hangs down on one side. So you don't have to reach through the vines It's all just hanging for you to pick. And then over here they have blueberries, and they actually grow the vegetables between the rows of blueberries and raspberries. Some of the products that he grows. Peppers, sweet peppers in high tunnels, and in Canada, until he came, they didn't eat sweet peppers. Nobody knew what they were, so he introduced these. Tomatoes, asparagus. Have people heard of Alice Waters? The famous chef, slow food chef so when he was in California, he used to drive 5 hours north because Alice Waters would buy all of his white asparagus. In the U.S., there's no white asparagus. He was the only grower. Farming is complicated, so there's a lot of coordination that needs to happen. So this is an example of their system, one of their systems for communicating with the crew what needs to happen different times. And a lot of the small farms that I've been on and that I've worked with, the crews will all share lunches together. So, and that's not common in other businesses in the U.S. I don't know if it is here or not, but on farms, there's quite a few that do this. This is a farm that I helped set up. So I worked on farms for a number of years, and then in 2008, I went off on my own, and I started my own farm in 2009, which is a very small farm. I had been working with larger farms that were using tractors and that kind of thing, and I wanted to do everything by hand. And so I did that for 4 years, basically a large garden. And then after 4 years, the piece of land that I was borrowing, the owners wanted to do something else, something different with it. So in addition to farming, I also consult with other farmers and help other farmers set up their farms, and I do teaching, I teach workshops. And I write about farming. I wrote a book. I've written a lot of articles for farmers, specifically in a journal for growers in the U.S. And this farm was one that I had consulted with when they were first buying the piece of land. And then after those 4 years were up that I was on my own land, I needed another place to go. So they said, please come and set up our system. So I came and I worked with them for 3 years to set up their farm systems and then hand it over to them. So this is about a 60-acre farm, roughly 28 hectares. It goes back this way a little bit, and then along here and along there and back along here. Most of it is blueberries and forest, but there's about 5 acres of vegetables that we set up. So what's that, 2.5 hectares, something like that. So a picture of the field. We grew a lot of cut greens for salad mix, but all different vegetables. We were probably growing 40 or 50 different vegetables. I was experimenting for a number of reasons with about 20 or 30 different culinary herbs on this particular farm. There was also a woman there who was growing cut flowers and the blueberries. This is a cart that I designed. So this is what we'd use for transport. This was our system for organizing the harvest. So everything, not just the harvest, all the work day. Everything would get written up on a whiteboard in the barn, and that way the crew, which was about 5 people, all had a central place to see what is it that the next tasks are that need to be done, and to check off when things were actually done so that everybody knew what was happening at the same time. We also kept a lot of records, so in the morning I would make a harvest sheet, and I would write this list out, and then people would write in this list of what needed to be harvested from those places, and then they would write in what actually got harvested and where they got it from. When it came into the barn, we'd write out again what comes into the barn, how much of it actually came into the barn, keeping the records. Every account that we sold to got an invoice, and then we would write on the invoices to make sure that we had packed their order completely. So small farms in the U.S., there's a number of different marketing channels, but they generally tend to be fairly direct. I sell through CSA, Community Supported Agriculture, which I hear is not very popular here, but there's maybe a handful, a few. So what I do is I figure out my crop plan for the entire year, all the vegetables that I'm going to grow, and I try to have an even harvest all through the year. So what it is changes, but there's always a variety every single week. And then people at the beginning of the season, they sign up and they say, we're going to take your harvest all year long. And they give me the money up front, more or less. And then every week they come to my farm and they collect their share of the harvest for that day. So I do that for about 68 families. This farm did a program like that, but it also sold to restaurants. So this is a restaurant, and the restaurants would order directly from the farm, and then we had a delivery truck, and we would deliver directly to the restaurant. And in the Portland area where I am, that's fairly common for farms to do that, and for restaurants to have relationships directly with farms. We also sold to some produce markets. And we would do the same thing. We would go and they would put in an order, we would go and deliver. And we do we do deliveries twice a week. Tuesdays and Fridays. CSA members only pick up one day a week. The other, I'll show you some pictures of the other common marketing outlet in a second. Let's see. Okay, so this is when everything comes in the barn, we weigh it. There's a scale there right next to the whiteboard. And then we wash it, clean it. This is it's upside down, but this is how we wash our salad greens. And there's a spinner there for getting them dry. And then we deliver it. We did have a delivery van, but I love bicycles. So I worked out a deal with a cargo bike shop, and they leased me this cargo bike, and I would deliver a lot of our CSA shares with the cargo. So these are, there's actually bags inside of the boxes for the CSA members. And so that's how I deliver the CSA shares. 26 miles, so about 40 kilometers on the bicycle. With about, 200 pounds is 120 kilos? Something like that. Oh, just a fun picture. Pumpkins. Do you have Halloween here? I think. Yeah. This is Halloween. This is another friend of mine who I've farmed with in the past, but has his own farm now. Danny, the guy in the orange there. And he does kind of a unique thing. So he has a CSA, but his CSA only happens in the winter. So he starts his harvests. He harvests some stuff for storage, so onions and winter squash and that kind of stuff, but he just holds it in storage. And then he starts harvesting the greens and distributing his CSA shares in November. And he keeps distributing vegetables until April. And then he takes a month off, and then he plants, and he does all of his cultivation of the crops, and then doesn't start harvesting again until the next fall. So he has a winter CSA, which is a little bit unique. We're in our area, so he's just north of me by maybe 30 minutes. We might get as cold as -6, -7, but that's unusual. Usually, most of the time, it's above 0. all through the winter, and raining. You can see it raining. More pictures. Danny's farm is about, I think it's about, I'm trying to remember, maybe 1.5 hectares, something like that. And he lives in the house right there on the edge of the photo. This land is his wife's parents' land. So they live in the woods back behind, and it's where his wife grew up. That's actually kind of unusual in the U.S. Most small farms, farmers in the small farm world in the U.S. are first generation, and their family didn't own any land. So they've either bought the land or they're leasing land. Another picture of this place. So he has a greenhouse on site. Another thing that seems different where in the U.S. from here, I've been hearing that most people get their transplant starts from nurseries, and that there are some farms that do that, and the larger farms do that. But most small farms have their own greenhouse where they grow their own starts and their own transplants. So almost everybody has a greenhouse where they're doing propagation. I'll show you more pictures of those in a minute. And then also a lot of tunnels for season extension for growing in the wintertime. There's an example of share from Danny. This is a farm. I'm going to go back to the map for a second. So this is another one that's in Vermont. So over here, Danny's farm is in Washington, right about there. This one's in Vermont. Pete's Greens. This actually is not necessarily a small farm, but it started out as a small farm. So Pete Johnson started out about 25 years ago. 20 years ago. Started about 20 years ago, just growing salad greens on maybe a 1/4 hectare. Very, very, very small. But he has grown over time, and he now farms about, he farms about 100 hectares of vegetables, mixed vegetables. And he's in Vermont, which is very, very cold in the wintertime. It's hot in the summer, but very cold in the wintertime. Lots and lots of snow. So he does a lot in tunnels. This is an incredible tunnel that he built out of logs. So it's all wooden frame. And it's, I think it's about 150, 200 meters long and maybe 30 meters wide. Really enormous tunnel. And it's for salad greens and that kind of thing. He also has some engineered houses, so that was an early tunnel that he built, but grows a lot of greens. And this is another way that people sell stuff is through a farm stand. So this is his farm stand. So just on the roadside, and they'll have their own farm stand where they're selling their own produce, but maybe also bringing things in from some other people in the area. This is a farm in New York, Hardy Roots. So in the Hudson River Valley, right about here, about 2 hours north of New York City, an hour and a half north of New York City. There's an organization called in the U.S. called the National Young Farmers Coalition, and they do lobbying to help young farmers, and they also have programs, education programs for young farmers and that kind of thing. The owners of this farm are the ones that started the National Young Farmers Coalition, Benjamin Shute and Lindsay Lusher Shute. They farm about 15, 20 hectares of vegetables, and they do both CSA and farm stand. So their fields. This is also in December. I love to visit farms, but because I'm farming, I usually get to visit farms in the winter, so not always the prettiest pictures. So here's their propagation house. It doesn't have anything in it right now because they're not growing anything in December in there, but that's all bottom heat tables with the hot water system in there, and they roll back and forth to open up aisles so that you can actually access them. That's their daughter. Big tractors, not the biggest, but really large. This is their packing shed where they pack all the produce. They also do chickens for laying hens. Anybody recognize this tool? This is an egg washer. So you feed the eggs in one side, and the brush spins around, and there's a little thing that conveys them along, and there's water spraying on them, and then it comes out the other side. So this is how they wash all their eggs. This is probably has become, so in the 70s, these got started, and they kind of grew more in the 90s and 2000. They, at this point, very, very popular to have farmers markets. But it's a relatively newer thing in the U.S. And they're all, there's very few permanent markets, so they're all in public spaces that are parks or something else, parking lots during the week, and then for a few hours on a weekend or maybe a weekday evening or something, all the farmers will come and they'll set up their tents and then bring their produce, and then they'll break it down at the end of the day and take it away. This one is actually one of the larger ones. It's one of the green markets on Union Square in New York City. The Portland one looks similarly large. We have one of the very largest ones. In the middle of the country, Madison has a huge one. At this point, Portland, where I live, we have a population of about, I think, 1.5 million people. And we probably have, I think there's about 25 or 30 farmers markets during the week. There's 6 major ones and then lots of little neighborhood ones that happen. These are all run by the farmers. The farmers are selling themselves. There's nobody's buying in. It's all the farmers selling. And then there's also some prepared food there, some breads, those kinds of things as well, to get more people to come. This is a farm in Pennsylvania. Go back. So these guys are just north of Philadelphia, and right about here. This one is I think it's a half a hectare, maybe smaller. Very, very small. They actually have a very unique way of delivering their produce. So they primarily grow salad greens. I'll show you those in a second. This is their compost. They make that with the tractor bucket. You can see it there. And then they spread it, and then they use this tool to prepare the beds. They do a lot in tunnels. Lots of salad greens, lots of smaller crops. They do tomatoes as well. And they do these salad greens up on tabletops inside the tunnels year-round. So they sell their produce to chefs in New York City who will pay a lot of money for it. And they use UPS, so they just ship it next day air. And it gets to actually, I don't think they even use next day air because I think New York City is so close that it just gets there the next day. But basically, they ship it one day to New York City, and the chefs pay for the shipping cost. Very typical of a lot of small farms, super funky packing shed, like just, dirt floor with maybe a little rock and some shade. That's a walk-in cooler. Maybe an old kitchen sink from a restaurant sitting next to an old house. This farm is Wintergreen Farm, and this is back in Oregon where I am. And they're another typical small farm, got started in the 70s. And all these farms that I'm talking about now, and most of the small farms that are really successful in the U.S. are organic, or they're practicing organic, maybe not certified organic. These guys, it's not a huge thing in the U.S., but these guys are biodynamic, and they are kind of the hub of biodynamics in Oregon. So there's a biodynamic group in Oregon, and growers get together 4 times a year to just to socialize, but also to make the preps and to dig up the preps. Do people know about biodynamics? Is that something a little bit? It's a biodynamic winery, yes. So they grow about 15 hectares of vegetables, and then they also have, I think, another, I want to say maybe 60 or 80 hectares of pasture for beef cattle, and they grow hay and beef cattle. And there's a picture of the group getting together to dig up the horns. Yeah. This guy right here, Wally, he's kind of the guru in the group. And this guy right here, he's actually from the very south of Oregon, Don Tipping. He's a seed grower. We live in an area, and actually in Oregon Oregon has a lot of distinct climates. So let me go back to this photo right here. So this part of Oregon right here is called the Willamette Valley. There's the coast right here, so the Pacific coast, and then there's some very low mountains along here called the Coast Range. And then there's a big wide valley. That's the Willamette Valley. And then down here, in this area, it's fairly mountainous with small valleys and very hot and dry down here. And then there's the Cascades, so more mountains, but it's not a mountain range like the Dolomites or the Alps. It's individual volcanoes. So they go from, in Portland, we're at, we're about 20 meters above sea level. And Mount Hood is about 4,000 meters, and it's only an hour drive to get up onto the mountain. So you can go in a very short distance, and it stands by itself. And then there's another one that's another 100 miles south of that. So that's what this mountain range is. And then this side of the state, this entire side of the state, is desert. Totally dry. Very, very dry. So Don is a seed grower, and he's a seed grower down in the southern area. We're actually totally dry in the summertime, but we're very, very wet in the wintertime. But that makes really excellent climate for growing seeds. So there's actually a lot of seed growers in our state, and also up in Washington as well. Okay, so this is the last section of slides that I have. And this is my farm now. So Cully Neighborhood Farm. When I started, what I was most interested in was farming inside the city. I came from the city. I didn't have a farming background. My great uncles, my father's uncles, were farmers in Ohio, in the middle of the country. And that was and I never ever met them. Never went to their farms. But I was really interested in food and very interested in sustainability, ecological agriculture, and that's how I got into farming. I was also really interested in community building and community development and social justice. And so I wanted to mix all those things, and I thought urban agriculture was the perfect way to do that. I met a guy who, early on when I was starting to learn about farming, I met this guy who had quite a bit of experience in urban agriculture all over the world, international urban agriculture. And he recommended to me that I go and learn farming from farmers like I've been showing you, who are out in the countryside, and then bring that back to the city instead of going in with a gardening background and trying to build a farm out of a garden. So that's what I did. Cully Neighborhood Farm is kind of coming back to that. So I'm in the middle of Portland on a 1 acre lot, so about a half hectare lot. And we farm about half of that, so quarter hectare, something like that. It's a part-time farm. It's had a couple of different iterations. So I didn't start this farm. A friend of mine actually started it, but I've kind of, over the last few years, I've basically taken it over as he's gotten busy with another project. But for the last 8 years, I've been farming part-time, just 2 or 3 days a week. And that's a little bit, in some ways it's a little bit unusual in the U.S., but it works really, really well for me because I find it's a great balance between the hands-on, in the field, in the dirt work, and then the teaching and the writing and everything else that I do with farmers. So I don't feel like I can do either one without the other one. So Cully Neighborhood Farm is, I mentioned before, almost entirely CSA, but we do this thing on the side for our CSA members. We always have a little bit of surplus, or a lot of times we have a little bit of surplus of something. And so we have a little farm stand where people can add more vegetables to their share, and they just pay extra for that. And then we also wanted to make it available to other people in the neighborhood. So if there's somebody who doesn't have a CSA share, they can come and take advantage of the farm stand. So this is just a picture of our farm stand sign. This is how we run our CSA. So people do CSAs all differently. Like I showed you the picture before with the boxes that had the bags in them. We were pre-packing all of that, taking them into the city and delivering them. Because we're in the city, right in a residential neighborhood, in the middle of a residential neighborhood, we just have everybody come to the farm. Most people walk or ride their bicycle. Some people do drive. And then what they do, we set it all out on these tables, and we have these little signs here that says how much to take, and everybody brings their own bag, or we have bags, paper bags if people haven't brought their own bag, and they fill their bag with what we tell them to take. If there's something that they don't want, then they take it and they put it in this box here. And if there's anything in that box that they want, they can take it. So that way we try to, give people a way to use the vegetables that they're not going to use themselves. At the end of the day, when we have surplus, the extras go to a food bank or food pantry. I don't know, do you have food pantries here? Do people know what that is? So in the U.S., it's they're usually run by churches or that kind of thing, and it's for people who don't have enough money to buy enough food, and they give out free food basically, in a metered way. So that's how we do our distribution. We also work with another farm that raises chickens for eggs, and they bring eggs for our CSA members, but only the CSA members who want them. This is a picture of the entire farm. So this fence line over here to this fence line over here. I'm standing at one end, and it goes to where these trees are right there. And then behind it is actually a church that has an elementary school. And I'll tell you a little bit more about that in a second, but the church is the one that owns the property, and they let us use the property in exchange for maintaining the property. Like I mentioned before, most small farms, ours included, we grow our own starts. So we buy seed, and then we seed in the greenhouse. Most of the seed we seed in the greenhouse first. This is where we put those trays. So this is called a germination chamber, and it's dark, but it's warm and moist. So this is a pot of water down at the bottom, just a dish tub full of water. and it has an aquarium heater, like for fish. And there's a little thermostat that turns it on and off, and there's a front that goes on this. And then that keeps it at about 70 degrees in there and 100% humidity. And so it takes for most seeds, it takes about 3 days, and then we pull the trays back out, and then the plants come up. So that's how we germinate things. This is a picture, kind of a warped picture of our greenhouse. So that germination chamber is right here, and there's a bench where we do this, where we actually put the seed in the trays. There's a bench over here where we fill with potting soil. So we mix our potting soil here and fill the trays with potting soil there. It comes over here, we seed them, and then they go onto these benches, and the benches have irrigation. We're only working 2 days a week. Yeah. You're asking...
Can you tell the size of this tunnel?
Yes, it's, I can tell you in feet very quickly. It's 20 feet by 20 feet, which is about 7 meters by 7 meters. Yeah. A little bit smaller than that, but roughly. And when we this is the very beginning of the season here, so it's not very full. And we actually never completely fill this greenhouse for our production. So that's where we grow all the plants. Here's another picture of it at a different point. This is actually in a different year, but full of plants. We only work 2 days a week, so the irrigation is on a timer. But this also happens, the guy in the last picture, this guy here, he's the guy that started the farm. He's actually over here too. It's trick photography. So he lives in a house that's 1 block away from the farm. It's a little bit of a coincidence. It's a long story, but so the greenhouse is actually at his house, not at the farm. And so he kind of keeps an eye on it, but almost all of the watering is done automatically by a timer. So he doesn't have to do very much. This is one of the ways that we seed some of the crops. So we'll put the seeds in these, they're called speed trays, and then we germinate them, and then we pull them out of those trays when they get just this big, and we pot them up into larger cells. We use cover crops over there on the left. We also use some tarps. These are all fairly typical practices. These are peas that are germinating. It's the early spring. Lots of cover crops for fertility. I do a little bit of seed saving. It's not actually that typical on farms, small farms in the U.S., but I know a lot of seed savers, and I'm interested in some particular varieties. This is chard seed, Swiss chard seed that I'm saving, and we use about this much Swiss chard seed in a year, and this was about 20 liters of seed came off of that, so we had a lot of extra seed. Corn, beans, and squash. It's not a typical crop for a farm, especially as small as we are, but it's kind of a personal interest of mine growing those, so I grow those all together. And this is actually one of the corns that I grow, which is otofile, and I actually got it from a farmer here in Italy. And then the other corn that we grow is black popcorn, Dakota black popcorn. Do people eat popcorn? Yeah? I've never seen it. So we use a 2-wheel tractor, Italian, BCS, the Berta flail mower, rotary plow to make the beds. And then a power harrow to flatten them out. This is a bed marker, so you can see. Can you see the grid on the? So we just roll that over top of the beds. That marks out the plant spacing, the rows, and the spacing. And then we mostly transplant by hand with a trowel. We do some overhead irrigation, sprinkler irrigation, and we do a lot of drip irrigation. I don't think I have a picture of the drip, but we do a lot of hoeing. So this is, you can't see the hoe head because it's under the ground, but this is a hoe. And then a lot of work with a wheel hoe. I don't know if people are familiar with that. I'll show a picture in a second. Pushing the wheel hoe with the blade through to keep for weeding. I don't know. Are there any farmers in this room? Anybody who uses a wheel hoe? Yeah.
Not a wheel hoe.
Not a wheel hoe?
One or two.
Yeah. I'll just show you one thing. So this has a blade here, and then it's got tines behind, and that makes it work better. Little tip. So the other thing that for our CSA members that we do is there's some things that we just don't want to harvest and that not that many people actually take advantage of, but some people really love and are easy to grow. So cut flowers and culinary herbs. We have a little garden right next to the pickup spot where people can pick their own. So it's this garden right here. So just a little corner of the farm. That used to originally, that garden was actually a kid's garden for the elementary school, but the elementary school stopped using it. We'd like the elementary school to come back and use it again, but they don't have the funding to have a person to do that, and we don't have time to facilitate it. This is how we wash most of this stuff.
Is the wood treated?
No, it's totally raw. The Pacific Northwest, where I live, is kind of famous as a forest for forestry. We have a lot of Douglas fir, and it's a wood that's fairly resistant to rotting. Yeah, and it's pretty cheap in our area. Some of the peppers that we grow, tomatoes, more peppers, basil, eggplant. Escarole. Are you familiar with escarole? Radicchio? Anybody heard of radicchio? Celeriac. And I think that's the last picture. So that's kind of just a quick look at my world of small farming in the U.S. I don't know what it looks like here in comparison, but I'm learning a little bit more on this trip, so it's great. So thank you for coming, and if anybody has questions, I'm happy to answer. Yes?
I have one question. Just how big is the total size of the small farmers in the U.S. in relation to these huge, big areas? Like
tiny.
Very tiny.
Yeah, almost nothing. Yeah. So that said, it's growing.
It's growing.
More and more. And
because as we know in the US you have one state that is nearly only producing potatoes, the other one is only doing green asparagus, the others do only tomatoes.
Yeah.
So and then it's transported all over the country. So it's a crazy form of farming and
absolutely
only one or two varieties per item.
Yeah, absolutely. So it's still an incredibly small percentage. So, but it's growing. There's getting more and more all the time. So I've been doing this for about 20 years now. And when I first started, I've been in Portland for 20 years. I've been doing it a little bit longer than 20 years, but I've been in Portland for 20 years. When I first moved to Portland, I knew about 12 CSA farmers in the Portland area, kind of around Portland, and I was one of them. And that was everybody who had a CSA. There were a few other small farms But that was everybody that had a CSA, and that was most of the small farms kind of in this style that I'm showing. Now, 20 years later, I do not know all the farms, and there are probably between 60 and 80 farms that are doing that just for Portland itself. So that's pretty good growth. And when I first came to Portland, there was one farmer's market. It was the Saturday market. Oh, no, sorry, there were two farmers markets. There were two main farmers markets. Now there's probably 25 or 30 farmers markets in Portland. So it's still a very small percentage of the total food coming into Portland, but it's definitely growing. I think at one point we estimated that it was maybe 2 or 3% coming from small farms of vegetables.
In Portland.
In Portland, which is ahead of the curve in the rest of the country. Yeah.
And what is the gross income that you can make per hectare? If hectare is around 2.5 acres.
I think it's 2.2. Yeah. That I want to be careful answering that question because it's not about gross per acre. So the gross can be deceptive. The number that I like to calculate, and I published this number, I actually just published the number for my farm on my blog about a week ago from the previous year, and I've been doing that for a number of years, so you can link back to all of that. But the number that I like to calculate is not the gross per acre, but the net dollars generated per labor hour. So how much money is going per labor hour that's worked after expenses, so, once the expenses have been, the non-labor expenses have been paid. My numbers, which I think are probably actually maybe, I would guess they're kind of in the middle. I don't know that because I don't have the numbers from a lot of other people, but the few other farmers that I've been able to get numbers from, I think I'm kind of in the middle, and we don't push it really, really hard trying to get as much money out of the farm as we could. I think this year we were at about $15 per hour. So that's kind of what's available for us. So that's an average across all the workers. And the other thing, and I was asking this question to some other farmers earlier, and I was asking here what the minimum wage was. In Portland, it's different everywhere in the country, in the U.S. In Portland, it's $12.50 an hour. That's the minimum wage. So I have to pay my workers at least $12.50 an hour. That $15 an hour has to pay the $12.50 plus my payroll taxes, because as a business owner, I have to pay payroll taxes. But my payroll taxes, I'm sure relative to here, are very, very low. So it's maybe adding another $1.50 an hour or something. Yeah.
Why did you choose to leave the tractor and do it by hand?
It's funny because I'm a very mechanical person. My training is mechanical engineering, but I just don't like tractors. I would rather be working in the dirt with the plants. In quiet nature, I can hear the birds, everything else. Not sitting on top of a big loud machine spewing diesel fumes, and I can't hear anything, and it's vibrating, and I just don't like that as much. So it's a personal choice. Yeah.
And how many of these farms do it seems like?
None.
No.
Yeah, a few of them might be using a two-wheel tractor instead of a larger tractor, but almost everybody uses a four-wheel tractor. It's so much less expensive and compared to the amount of work that it can do. And I really love the small scale, but the reality is that we have a lot of space available, and so it doesn't always make sense. In the urban setting, it absolutely makes sense, but there's still relatively good access to larger spaces outside of the cities, and so pretty much everybody uses tractors because it's less expensive. Dollars.
Well, it depends on the scale of farm.
It
If you
depends.
have a really tiny farm,
Then it doesn't make sense. Yeah, no, it doesn't. Yeah. And it doesn't actually change the number of dollars per hour that you're making. It just changes the amount of space that you can work. So, but not that many farmers look at their numbers is the other thing. So they look at the bottom line at the end of the year, but they don't look at all the other numbers. So that's I think it's starting to change. I hope it's starting to change. Well, thank you all for coming. If there's any other, I'll be around.